Alrighty. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Wall-Bollinger. I'm with the New York State Association for Rural Health. We're presenting this webinar in collaboration with the New England Rural Health Association. And it will be LGBTQ education, the complexities of identities. The learning objectives for this session are to develop a deeper awareness and understanding of the complexity of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including their historical and biological realities, understanding and articulating the evolving identities and terminologies associated with sex and gender, and identifying and analyzing ways in which discrimination, harassment, and prejudice related to sexual or gender identities manifest in families, educational, and healthcare settings. There were no conflicts in the development of this session. And this session will provide CHES credits. It's sponsored by the New York State Association for Rural Health and the New England Rural Health Association, a designated provider of continuing education contact hours in health education by the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing. This program was designated for certified health education specialists and/or master certified health education specialists to receive up to one total Category 1 continuing education contact hours. There's no master level. The mission of the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing is to enhance the professional practice of health education by promoting and sustaining a credentialed body of health education specialists. To meet this mission, NCHEC Certified Health Education Specialists promotes professional development and strengthens the professional preparation and practice. We also want to make you aware that the Public Health Partnership Conference is coming up in April, and now is the time to submit your abstracts. So if you have a workshop idea that you would like to share with the world, we would really, really like to see you present it. This abstract is a pretty convenient format. It's not super long. It just requires you to give the highlights of what it is that you'd like to talk about, some information about yourself and your learning objectives. And they are due by November sometime soon. So please, November 13th. So please make sure that you do submit some ideas that you have for presentations. We usually get about 100 abstracts, and from that whittle it down to maybe 20 that are presented. So it's competitive, but it's not impossible. And you can scan the QR code to directly link into the Oxford Abstract platform. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Scott Fearing began his LGBTQ activism in the early 1980s with a focus on HIV and AIDS. I remember those days. In 1993, he was hired as the coordinator for education and training by Minnesota's Gay and Lesbian Community Action Council, which is now called Outfront Minnesota, where he worked for 13 years, focused on community organizing in rural Minnesota. In 2006, Scott moved to Rochester, where he was hired as the Director of Education by Out Alliance. In 2023, he was promoted to Executive Director, a position he held for 5 years. In April of 2019, he joined the University of Rochester as the coordinator for LGBTQ and safe space programs. In his decades of work in the LGBTQ plus speaker and educator, his efforts have taken him far and wide, working with thousands of organizations, thousands, including us now, across the country. Welcome, Scott Fearing.
Terrific. Thank you. All right. Looks like my mic is working. It sounds like we're okay to go. All right. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction to myself, and then we'll dig into the deep stuff. So I do like to warn folks, I'm not a native of upstate New York. I'm a native Minnesotan. And the reason I like to put that out there is every now and then my strange Minnesota accent sneaks out and you'll hear the long vowels. So if you've ever seen the movie Fargo, you know what I'm talking about. So just that's the heads up. I landed here in Rochester, New York, again, about 20 years ago when the person who back then was my boyfriend, because it was illegal for us to marry, he's now my husband. He wanted a career change and became a student here in Rochester at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And quite frankly, there's a branch of that RIT that is called NTID, which is the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. So my husband is a deaf guy and came here to go through technical school and ended up getting his degree in woodworking and now builds custom tables, chairs, things like that. This is not a commercial message. It's just to sort of let you know sort of what brought me to Rochester. I came up to visit him the first Thanksgiving he was being a student here. And it was one of those, well, what I now know is very, very rare Thanksgivings, in that it was sunny and the sky was blue. And we went down to Letchworth and we went to the Finger Lakes. And, at the end of my 3 days here, I was like, I'm going to go home, sell the house, and let's move to Rochester. It's a good place for us as a gay couple. Winters are a lot warmer in Rochester than they are in Minnesota. And for him, his quality of life as a deaf person here in Rochester is much better. If you didn't know, Rochester per capita has the largest deaf population of any city in the world. So for him as a deaf person, it's a great place to be, as it were. So that's how I ended up landing here. And as you heard, I've got lots and lots of background and experience doing LGBTQ stuff. And I did indeed start by doing HIV and AIDS work, basically as a college student. So here I am in 1980, I come out of the closet, and literally within a few months, my fellow 20-year-olds are dying of these strange diseases. And so I spent a number of years doing hospice care for my fellow 20-year-olds. I then spent a short period of time working for the Minnesota Department of Health, creating and delivering workshops on safer sex and the dangers of HIV and AIDS, and because a lot of people didn't know anything about it at that point in time. And then, as my bio told you, I then got into doing more political work from an LGBTQ perspective. So we're here today to talk about sort of LGBTQ stuff in general. And what I want to do is go ahead and bring on my slides. Now, what I'm not going to do is take over your whole screen. You have the option of bringing your mouse, your pointer, whatever you want to call it, up over my image and saying pin, and that will increase the size so that as we go through some of the other slides where there's more information, you'll be able to see it a little bit more clearly. But this is just sort of my way of looking at things and handling it. So I will be part of the on-screen presentation. So not only do you have to look at the information that I'm presenting, but you got to look at me as well. Sorry, that's the way I work. I find that this is a much better way to proceed through things. One of the things I want to mention that I didn't in my little introduction is I did for 4 years. I had a grant back in Minnesota to work in rural communities on LGBTQ stuff. So I spent 4 years working around Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa, avoiding the big cities of those small places, and really working in rural communities on LGBTQ issues. And it was in many ways the most rewarding part of my 40 whatever years of doing this work. Some amazing things happened. I've been given credit by others, and I'll take it, that when Minnesota did a vote on marriage equality, Minnesota was the only state that voted to block a law limiting marriage to only men and women. And many people say it was because of the work that we had done in rural Minnesota, having these conversations, getting people to come out. So I'm somewhat aware of some of the challenges that rural communities can put out there. I mean, I grew up in one myself, so lots and lots of different things to cover. I've got my email on the screen here right now. I know that you'll be getting a copy of these slides when things are all over. Feel free to reach out to me anytime with any questions that you have. I love providing these workshops and be glad to travel wherever, whenever, to help keep the conversations going. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into a few things. First thing I want to do, and it seems kind of silly, but I want to start by putting the rainbow flag on the screen. Probably everybody here is familiar with the rainbow flag. We know it's part of the LGBTQ identity. You saw it hanging on the wall behind me. But most people don't know what or where or how that happened. And I'd just like to give, again, a pretty brief introduction, even though I'm a nerd on this history stuff. I love talking about it. This flag was introduced in 1978 in San Francisco as part of their Gay Freedom Day celebration, what today we would call a Pride celebration. One of the people on the planning committee for that was a guy who was an artist, and he came up with this idea of creating these colorful flags to represent LGBTQ community folks, again, at the Gay Freedom Day. And so he created this idea of these flags, and he and his friends, literally in their apartments, were stitching and putting these flags together through the spring and summer of 1978, getting ready for the festival. Again, his name was Gilbert Baker. And the most important thing I like to stress is these colors had nothing to do with identities. So it wasn't, green for gay and orange for lesbian or whatever. The colors were meant and were talked about as part of life on our planet. So it was red for life and orange for healing and yellow for sunlight and green for nature and blue for peace and purple for spirit. So it was all these parts of sort of being a human being. It wasn't about being gay or lesbian or bi or any other identity. Things have changed a great deal over the years in that we now have a lot of different pride flags out there for lots and lots of different identities. But the rainbow flag remains sort of the universal flag that is, again, not about any particular identity, but is about the communities. And again, it was introduced in 1978 in June. It went globally the fall of that year following the murder of Harvey Milk. Some of you may know that name. Harvey Milk was a city council member, an out gay man, business owner in San Francisco. He had a business down in the gay neighborhood, as it were. And he was working to try to change some of the laws and policies in San Francisco. So the police were still doing raids on gay bars, things like that. And he was trying to stand against that. Well, one of his fellow council members didn't like all this gay talk going on and showed up at the city hall one day with a handgun and shot and murdered Harvey Milk, as well as the mayor. The toughest part was the guy who pulled the trigger was a former police officer and a friend of the chief of police, and so he was not arrested. So the LGBTQ community of San Francisco is mourning the loss of this amazing leader in the fall of 1978, and they're showing up in City Hall in mourning and in anger and frustration, and carrying these flags that they had seen introduced, shall we say, in June of that year. And the news media is there covering the story about these murders. And so suddenly around the world, people see the gay community, San Francisco, with these rainbow flags. And so that's how this became a symbol globally for LGBTQ identity people. So again, went global by the end of 1978 and has been around since. But like I said, there's lots and lots of other options that are out there these days, including this version of the flag that I'll put up here right now. This is oftentimes called the Progress Pride flag. So you've got the original rainbow flag, and then there's some other colors added in. You've got the black and brown stripe, which were originally added to the pride flag in 2017 in Philadelphia. They added the black and brown stripes as a reminder that the black and brown communities are part of the gay communities, as it were, right? Using that as an umbrella term. So there was the pride flag then with black and brown stripes. A little bit earlier than that, so around the year 2000, somebody had introduced the trans pride flag. And the trans pride flag was the pink and blue and white. And if you think about the colors pink and blue and you think about gender, right, there's that binary model of you're either this or you're that. And that flag was meant to say beyond the pink and blue, there's a space of safety, the white part of the flag. So that was really the story behind the trans pride flag, and which was really the first of the individual identity flags to be made. The flag that I have on the screen here, in addition to the pink, blue, and white, and black and brown, we've got this yellow area with the purple circle. It's a relatively new flag. It's one that's out there, but is being added into the Progress Pride flag on a pretty regular basis. A lot of them that I see hanging around town or on cars have this yellow and purple circle part, and that actually is an identity flag for the intersex community. And if you're not familiar with what intersex is, we'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit here. But it's important to understand how these things have changed over the years. A little bit later, I'm going to make available to you a 4-page glossary of terms and identities related to LGBTQ communities. 4 pages. It's a long document. And almost every single one of those identities has a pride flag of their own. So you can literally, if you're reading over that glossary and you see, I don't know, a non-binary and you don't know quite what that is, or you can go on Google and search for non-binary pride flag, you will have a flag that will come up. So there's lots and lots of different things that are out there these days, but I think it's important to understand. The other reason I like to really put this history out there is I'm a firm believer that the way to create a safe environment, to have good conversation, is to show a rainbow flag. It's quite easy, okay? So I've got here on my chest here a little rainbow flag. It's actually upside down, a little rainbow peace sign on my uniform. There's lots and lots of ways. If you're dealing with a client who you know has, I don't know, maybe wrestling with coming out of the closet themselves, or you've got a family and the kiddo is, claiming that they're non-binary and the parents don't get it, putting this on sends a message to the kiddo that, okay, we can have these conversations. I'll help in this conversation, things like that. So visuals, and we'll talk more about that later, can be really, really important. And I know here at the hospital, we have lots and lots of different things. Again, I work at the University of Rochester, lots and lots of different ways that we put visual messages out there. I'm going to slip off to the side here. You can actually see a t-shirt that the hospital created for Pride last year. It's got the little rainbow flower, and then it just says Pride 365. There's lots of different ways that these things can help to make a difference in people's lives. I want to just put out there that if you've got any questions, please drop them into the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that. And I'm going to encourage Sarah and anybody else, if a question comes into the chat and I don't see it, please let me know, because I'm busy looking over here at the software and the chat is over there and there's all these different things happening on my screen. So just let me know if there's a question I missed that needs to be addressed. And again, please don't be afraid. And if you're brave enough and you want to unmute yourself and shout out a question, I'm all for it. Don't be afraid to do that as well. All right, so let's continue moving forward here with a few things. One of the challenges, again, that we face from an LGBTQ plus community perspective is indeed that initialism I just put out there, LGBTQ plus. It's a kind of a tongue twister sometimes. I'm at the point where I've been doing this work long enough, it flows out of my mouth pretty easily, but I do remember the days when the initialism was different. But this is the one you most commonly see today. It's the ones you most commonly hear in the news. Sometimes the plus gets dropped. Sometimes the Q gets dropped as well. So you may just hear about the LGBT community or the LGBTQ community. Quite frankly, the plus is just about the fact that there are so many other identities that are part of the communities today. Again, you've got that glossary of terms I'll get to you later, that lots and lots of different folks with different identities coming into play. The Q tends to stand for one of two different things. It either stands for queer, which we'll talk about that word a little bit more later. Some people embrace it, some people really hate it, or questioning. So if somebody is like, oh, am I really gay? Am I bi? I'm not sure what I am. They're kind of part of this bigger community of identities, but they may not have an exact identity in their heart and soul yet. So they're still sort of questioning who they are and what their identity is going to be. So that's the LGBTQ plus identity, initialism, and what they all mean. Now, I want you to reflect for a second. Every single one of these identities have a common human element. There's one thing that they all have in common, okay? We know all about the differences there, but these labels, these identities that people have, all boil down and have something to do with sexuality, okay? And what we know is, in and of itself, that's a complex issue, right? We know that we think of sexuality these days and have been told by our current administration in DC that there are two genders, XX and XY, end of story. You're either a boy or you're a girl, a man or a woman, masculine or feminine, end of story, right? The reality is that even on this chromosomal level, things are much more complicated, right? We have built a system where, again, you've got two little check boxes when you're filling out a form. You either check this box or that box. But what we know is even on a chromosomal level, it's much more complicated. And what I want to do is to walk through a little model about sexuality and gender in order to give you some tools. Now, I just realized I made a bit of a mistake when I put things together here. I have a handout that I want to put in the chat for you. The challenge is I thought I was putting the handout in there, but in reality, what I have is the worksheet. So, oops, it's not going in. All right, let me copy the box file number here. Why are you not moving over there? It's not letting me drop it into the chat. Well, I'll try one more thing and then I'll give up and we'll just have to make do with it. Yep, it's not letting me add things to the chat. So I don't know if it did it during our presentation test. It did let me drop it. It's not anymore. So I'm not sure what's going on, but we're going to talk through the elements of human sexuality. And you can take notes if you want. If you want a copy of a handout in the end, you can email me or reach back to me, or I can include one when we send out the slides to you. So here's where I want to go with this. Lots of different elements. The first part, indeed, of our sexuality is indeed our gender. Okay. I like to use the term sex instead. Okay, and this is where we are talking chromosomes. We are talking XX and XY. We're talking about genitalia, reproductive abilities or not. Now, again, we think oftentimes in these two little boxes, right? XX and XY, end of story. The reality is what current research is showing is that only 1 in 16 of us are truly XX or XY, right? That most of us have variations in our X's and Y's that move us away from being the endpoints on that continuum. So again, we've got 13 people logged into this Zoom call today. Maybe one of us is truly XX or XY. Most of us probably have some variation. Now, those variations don't necessarily lead to birth defects or inability to reproduce, things like that. So they just move you away from sort of those endpoints a little bit. Now, as you get towards the center of those changes, you do indeed begin to see some physical manifestation of change. And that's where this whole concept of intersexuality comes out. An intersexual baby is a baby that is born, and I shouldn't say intersexual, an intersex baby that is born. The doctors look between that baby's legs and they're not sure what they're looking at. Right? Is a scrotum that didn't seal, a vulva that did, an oversized clitoris, a undersized phallus, whatever. There's all sorts of different ways that that can happen. So intersex births are probably far more common than you would believe. Statistics show that it's approximately 1 in every 2,500 births. So every 2,500 babies that are born, they have some variation in their physical gender. Okay, so that's quite common. And again, 1 in 16 of us have variations in our chromosomes that aren't necessarily visible, but for some folks that intersex identity is really where they end up landing. And there's some sort of physical manifestation that makes them look different down there. And again, there's great variety. One of the most common ways that intersexuality plays out is the individual is born with what looks like, quote unquote, normal female external genitalia, but they find out usually later in life that they don't have ovaries. They actually have a pair of testicles in their abdomen. So those things oftentimes show up that way. So lots and lots of different ways that intersexuality plays out. There's actually a great documentary. If you want to do a little Google search, you can watch it either through YouTube or I think it might still be on Netflix, actually just called Intersex. And it interviews folks, including a person from Rochester, New York, who was born at Strong Hospital in 1957 and was born with variable genitals. And at that point in time, the doctors basically went to mom and dad and said, hey, look, this happens. Your baby looks different down there. Take your baby home, love them. They will tell you as they enter adolescence probably what gender they identify with, if they feel more like a mommy or a daddy or a boy or a girl, right? And that is this person's experience. Jim, again, born in 1957, never had surgery done or anything done to his genitalia. Urination was not an issue. And that historically is how intersex births were always handled. However, beginning in approximately 1960, the American Medical Association defines intersexual births as a medical emergency. And part of why it's believed that that happened is because they suddenly had the technology to be able to do plastic surgery on genitals and make them look more, again, air quotes here, normal. So a child that was born with variable genitalia could be put into a body that looked normal. And almost every single intersex birth beginning in approximately 1960 was given female-looking genitalia because that was easier to make in almost all cases. So almost every single intersex birth, again, beginning in 1960, was given female body parts. No matter what else was going on, that's who they suddenly were told they were. Like I said, Jim, who was born in 57, never had any of those surgeries. As he entered adolescence, a doctor tried to convince him to become a girl, but he had already self-identified as a boy and said, no, I'm not going to become a girl. And happily, as he puts it, his parents supported him And rather than making him follow the doctor's advice, he got to grow up with the variable genitalia that he still has to this day. So complicated stuff. Again, we think it's so simple, two little boxes, but it's not. So that's the first part, is our physical gender, our sex. The second component is our gender identity. And this is, how do we define ourselves? How do we know ourselves? This isn't about what's between the legs. This is about what's between our ears. Do we do we know ourselves as a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, or maybe none of the above, right? Or some variation on such things, right? So it can be really, really complex, but this is the psychological sense of knowing our gender. That knowledge of gender between our ears is not measurable, right? There's no blood work or x-ray or anything else they can do, right? So gender between the legs, you can take a look, right? Literally, and figure out what body parts are there or not. The gender identity is something that is kind of invisible to the outside world. It's only that individual who knows themselves that can identify what their gender is. And that feeds into the next piece in this model, is the gender expression. How do we express our gender to other people? Okay. Do we act in a masculine way or a feminine way, or somewhere in between, right? Do we dress in a more androgynous way? And again, these are social structure pieces that are constantly changing. Now, we may believe that, masculinity has always been about tough guys and this and that. The reality is it has changed a great deal. It always changes. And culturally, it's very different. What it means to be masculine here in Rochester today is different than it is in Texas or Colombia or Paris or Thailand, right? How do you dress in a masculine way will vary a great deal, culture to culture, family to family, okay? So even though we think of these as, again, little things that are always there, it's very, very fluid. I mean, all we have to do is think back to our founding fathers, and those men of power wore wigs, big fluffy collars, and high heel shoes and high socks and things that today we would consider pretty feminine dress. But that was masculine at that point in time. So these things change. The next part of this model is our orientation. Okay, we hear oftentimes about sexual orientation. It's, who are we attracted to? Are we attracted to men, women, both? Maybe none, right? Whatever it might be. So there's, and what is the basis of our attraction, as it were, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that orientation plays out, but it is ultimately about our own individual attractions and how we define that. The final step in this model here is our behaviors. And this is, I'm talking about our sexual behaviors. How do we express ourselves sexually, and with whom? Do we do it with men, women, all of the above? Depends on the day of the week. Depends on how many beers I've had, whatever it might be. This stuff can play out in lots and lots of different ways. And yet we think that there is just one right way to be sexual. And even more challenging from an LGBTQ perspective is all the rest of this model gets erased oftentimes in people's mind, and they go right to behaviors. And I can tell you, there's been many times in my life where I've told somebody I'm a gay guy, and they look at me and they say, well, I don't care what you do in the bedroom. And I'm like, by telling you I'm gay, it's not telling you what, I'm not going to tell you what I do in the bedroom. That's, that's personal and private. But they immediately go to that sort of an idea. Okay. Trans people face it all the time as well. Okay. Somebody who's a trans man, people are like, well, what body parts do you have? How do you have sex? Right. Things like that. So behaviors sort of override almost everything else sometimes. The reality is all of us are part of this complex little model, and human sexuality is complex, and we need to own up to that fact and understand that it always has been. And it's not just human sexuality. If we look across the animal world, we look at plants, across all life on our planet, sexuality is pretty darn diverse, right? We know that there are fish, that if there are no male fish in that pot of fish, one of them can transition and go from being a female to suddenly becoming a male fish, right? These things happen in lots and lots of different ways. This summer, I was growing a cucumber in my garden, and it was growing really well, and the vines were all over and full of flowers, but it was never producing any fruit. And I mentioned it at the farmer's market to somebody there, and he's like, oh, well, you've got an asexual plant. Go ahead, rip it out, put a new one in, because it's not going to produce anything, right? It's not able to reproduce. So I was creating flowers, so it had that sort of feminine part to it, shall we say, but it was unable to produce fruit. So I don't know, intersex or asexual, whatever it might be, these things are part of life on this planet. Does anyone have any questions? Again, feel free to drop them into chat or just unmute yourself and shout them out. I would welcome any conversation that anybody might want to have. All right, so assuming that you're all okay with this, and again, my apologies for not being able to drop it. Let me try again, see if I can drop it into the chat. Have things been changed at all? Come on. Nope, it's still banning me from doing that. Anyway, again, we'll get you a copy of this if you want one. Since you're doing rural work, and again, I have some experience that way, one of the things I want to stress is that what ends up happening often more in smaller towns than bigger towns is this whole idea of a generation gap. Now, I go all the way back to the days of hippies, right? And I remember my parents being all upset about my sister's boyfriends who all had long hair, that boys shouldn't be dressed that way, right? There's this whole generation gap. And you know what was going on in the 60s had also happened back in the 40s and is going on today. There's this misunderstanding oftentimes between adults and kids and looking at the world. And these days, I believe, okay, I'll own up this is me, that with technology and TikTok and all that kind of stuff, these things are even more complex than they were. But one of the things that we know is that youth often go against their parents' beliefs, you know, in music, in different values, government, politics, sexuality, gender roles, culture, all sorts of different ways. There can end up being this generation gap, right? You know, you hear parents go like, oh, kids these days, kind of an idea. These things can be really challenging. And what we need to do is to be able to open our hearts and our minds and understand. And depending on your role in working in rural communities, you may have to help other people to open their hearts and minds to understand the difference between generations. And again, what we see broadly these days, and we'll dig into it a little more deeply in a second, is the difference in how young people versus older people see issues of sex and gender. And what we know is that the youth often unite in a world that their parents don't necessarily understand. So, you know, your kiddo and their friends are all busy talking about, you know, some TikTok video or whatever it might be around gender or sexuality or whatever it might be. And the parents are busy freaking out, but the kids are like, yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I get that, right? I understand that. So these things can be challenging at times. I'm going to take a sip of tea here and then we're going to move on. Anybody have questions or comments?
Scott, I think that not graph, but just kind of like talking through all that, I think is so incredibly important. Like I learned things and I would consider myself an ally. But I think, you know, when you think about it and you know, somebody being told like, oh, like you have a lot of male energy, like I never thought about it from that perspective. So I think it's really helpful. And then of course, as a mom, you know, I of course identify with kids are always challenging their parents. So
It
appreciate
is a
that.
reality.
Yes.
So
Jennifer, thank
Scott,
you
if
for
you're having
speaking.
trouble dropping something in the chat, feel free to email it to us and see if we could maybe get it in. I'm not sure why you can't do that.
All right, let me kind of off to the side here for a quick second before I move to the next piece of the
I'm
presentation.
sure we can send it out afterwards too, Scott, as well.
Okay, all right. Let me get to this through this. I'm looking here at the clock. We're already into things pretty deeply. So let me just move on to the next piece here, which again goes at that generational piece. And this
Thanks.
is a recent survey that was completed by the PRRI, and it's the Public Relations Religious Institute, I believe. But if you just do a Google search for PRRI, you will know what that initialism is. And they have done some really great work on LGBTQ issues in a very positive way. Oftentimes people hear the word religion and they're like, oh, they're going to be against LGBT folks. No, they actually just recently did these surveys and actually put out I want to say it's about a 25-page PDF with lots and lots of information in it. But this is the piece that I want to show right now. This came out in September of 2023. And what they did is they did a survey across America of people by birth generations and who identified as part of the LGBTQ community or who identified as straight, shall we say. And what you see here is some amazing statistical differences. So we've got here folks from the silent generation, so folks basically who are, you know, age 80 and above, about 3% of that population identified as LGBTQ. You get down to baby boomers, which is, I'm at the tail end of baby boomers, and it's about 4%. And then it goes up for Gen Xers, millennials, and we get to Gen Z, we're at 28% of the population identifying in some way with LGBTQ plus identities. And I can tell you, I was talking to folks over on our river campus here at the university, and they do a survey of incoming class, so what we used to call freshmen, and 31% of the students coming in and starting school this year in some way identified as part of the LGBTQ community. So basically a full third of the student body of that first year of students. So there's some huge differences here. Now, the first column on this graphic is that talking about 10% of all adults. That has historically been the number that we were told. It came out of some research done in the 1950s. It's the number that I've been quoting again for 40 years, saying, oh, 10% of the population is LGBTQ. Well, what we're seeing is some pretty major changes. And what I want to do is just emphasize, again, for you to think about the work that you're doing, where you've got, maybe a Gen Z kiddo who is, either getting ready to go off to college or maybe already in college, and their parents who are boomers or Xers may not understand what's going on or wanting to talk about those things. Or even more realistic from what I talk about here at the university is maybe we've got a doctor who's a part of Gen Z and is graduating and going out into the world and doing primary care. So they're 20 some years old, let's say 25, 27, and they have a patient come in who is, again, 60, 70, 80 years old, who hasn't been comfortable being out. And that doctor's like, well, how stupid are you? Just come out of the closet. It doesn't really matter, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that, again, these history and identity pieces can play out and be problematic. So again, you can find this study if you just do a Google search for PRRI. And again, they have this as well as an entire PDF document that you can download and take a look at. All right, the next thing I want to do is quickly jump to, and I'm going to try to be brief with this, even though this is my favorite part of everything. I'm a history nerd, is just looking at LGBTQ history here in the United States over the decades. What we know is that before, or with the arrival, shall we say, of white people here in the U.S. soil, North America, pilgrims, however you want to, colonization, however you want to think about it. We, the white folks arriving here, as well as the native communities who lived here, knew that all of those different identities existed. They knew that sometimes babies were born with different looking genitals. They knew that sometimes people with this kind of genital fell in love with people with the same kind of genitals. We knew that sometimes people with that kind of genitals actually operated and lived as somebody who has different genitals. So there was this understanding. So people were just sort of invisible, right? So we didn't have gay bars or gay clubs as America's being formed because people knew about those two bachelor farmers and it just was part of life. Well, that all began to shift and change by the late 1920s, early 1930s. And a lot of that change actually came from Germany. In 1927, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld opened up the Institute of Sexuality in Berlin and began researching basically all these issues and publishing papers. And he convinced the German government to issue new passports to individuals who were living in a new gender role versus the one they were assigned at birth. He did the very first trans surgery, I believe it was 1928. So all sorts of great stuff that he was doing. If you've ever seen the movie Cabaret, you have a sense of what was going on in Berlin when he was doing that work. Unfortunately, as you also learn from that movie, is there was a political party who was not very pleased with that going on. And what we find is in 1933, the Nazi Party gets elected into office. And part of their campaign and why they were elected to office was because Germany was being destroyed by these people who weren't living as men or women and were doing all these other things. So once they were voted in, one of the first things they did was to burn down the research library and the whole sexual institute in Berlin, and put together a series of holding cells, as it were, places later known as camps, where gay men were being locked up. And they began to experiment on ways to cure those gay men of their homosexuality. The most horrifying cure that they tried was they were implanting horse testicles into gay men, thinking that this rush of horse testosterone would suddenly make them find women attractive. Needless to say, those men died miserable deaths from those transplants, as it were. But that whole idea that it's a sickness and illness landed here in the United States. And so what we find is that by the 1930s here in America, there's a whole new way of looking at those two bachelor farmers, right? They're sick, they need to be taken care of, they need to be locked up, they need to be put away. And so we begin to see things happening. So at the end of Prohibition, Okay. New York State passes a law saying it is illegal to serve alcohol to homosexuals. They also pass legislation saying that you are required by law to wear 3 articles of clothing that are in line with the gender you were assigned at birth. So if you're a drag queen, you have to have 3 articles of men's clothing on, or you're breaking the law and you're going to jail. Right? So there's all sorts of things. 1953, President Eisenhower signs an executive order making it illegal for a homosexual to work for the federal government. So what we find is that a lot of people go silent, go into hiding. Okay. We have lots of examples where there was a lesbian who married a gay man. They both had lovers on the side, but to the world, they were this normal couple, right? As to use the term of the day, as it were. So people went silent, went into hiding. And that really lasted until 1969. Some of you may know the Stonewall Uprising, which was really the beginning of gay liberation here in America. It was a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan. The police went in to raid the place, and that night the patrons fought back, beginning primarily with trans women of color, but very quickly moving into hundreds of individuals fighting with the police. The riots lasted 3 days. There's some great movies out there, documentaries as well as actual movies, and looking at the Stonewall Inn riots and the history of what happened that night. But it really began the gay liberation movement and the whole idea of come out wherever you are kind of an idea. And that's really what happened through the 1970s. And I just realized here, my graphic is off a little bit. The AIDS generation really begins the 1982 kind of time frame, where it goes from getting people to come out and have conversations and gay liberation to basically trying to keep people alive. So the 1980s and into early 90s was a big focus from, again, liberation and trying to change policies to just plain, we need to keep each other alive. I mean, here in Rochester was the founding of what's now Trillium Health. And they were trying to reach out to the gay community saying, okay, you need to understand how to prevent yourself from getting this disease. 1993, the first AZT comes along that makes some change and has some impact on HIV and AIDS. And so then what we find is the community in the post-AIDS generation begins focusing on more, again, community work, changing policies, corporate policies, things like that. So the post-AIDS generation really is about creating systems that are changing. They also focus a lot on youth, because what we find is by the 1990s, a lot of young people are committing suicide because their parents are so anti-LGBTQ, as it were. And so there's lots and lots of focus on GSAs in schools, gay straight alliance or gender and sexuality alliances in schools. And there also begins to be this push for marriage equality. Marriage equality finally happens in 2015 here in America. And then what ends up happening is within the LGBTQ community, there begins to be more of a focus on intersecting identities. So what does it mean to be a Black gay person versus a white gay person, or whatever the other identities may be intersecting? And then a real focus again on bringing back discussions around trans issues that were kind of hidden away during the marriage debate years. So lots and lots of history there. I could go on for many, many hours, as you can tell. I just think it's really important, because if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I'll be very point blank. Some of what we're hearing today is very similar to some of what we heard back in the silent generation, right? When we were locking people up for being one of those. So I think it's really important that we understand sort of where we are today and hopefully where we can go into the future. All right, let's very quickly run through some other stuff. Now, this stuff is a little bit more focused on elderly, which I understand is a focus of some of the work that you're all doing. But let me just walk through these numbers. Currently, about 3 million Americans over the age of 50 identify as LGBT. That's expected to double to 7 million by 2030. Okay, we looked at that chart before of escalating populations by birth year. So we're looking at lots and lots of older folks who are part of the community. What we know is that older LGBTQ people may have had trauma, okay, from being considered mentally ill. Up until 1973, if you were a homosexual, you were going to get locked up in the asylum. I actually know of people here in Rochester, older folks, who were locked up over on Elmwood Avenue, which is right down the street from where I'm standing at the university today, because they were homosexuals and their parents caught them or heard about it and locked them up to try to cure them of their homosexuality. So older folks sometimes are carrying around some of that stuff and may have some distrust of systems, as it were. What we know is thousands of LGBTQ plus citizens die earlier than straight citizens, oftentimes because they are living isolated lives. They may be afraid to seek care. They may not trust living in a senior community or trying to find care that way. So there's all sorts of different reasons and ways that LGBTQ plus people are not as visible, shall we say, and can end up having huge health impacts. All right, so now I want to kind of go backwards a little bit, but just look at how language has changed over the years. So way back when, the word sodomite was used to talk about those people. Okay, and that can go way back. What we know is that for many years, beginning in 1868, the word homosexual was created, and that was the way to talk about those people. Okay, whether they were, well, today we'd call gay or lesbian or trans or whatever, they were homosexuals. Okay, the term actually was invented in Germany, and it was invented to help advocate for the rights of LGBTQ plus people, but it very quickly, again, turned into a pretty ugly thing. So we go from sodomite to the term homosexual. In the 1950s here in America, and a lot of people don't know this, we had a movement called the homophile movement, and this was a group of individuals, what we would later call gay liberation, but they were trying to help make social change happen and organizing LGBTQ folks and having rights and marches and things like that. Again, very curious stuff. The only biting my tongue here because I want to say so much more. The thing I find most interesting is they were forbidden. So there were branches of the homophile movement in Chicago, New York City, and San Francisco. They were forbidden from mailing items about their work to each other because it was considered pornography, and the U.S. Postal Service would find them and destroy the materials. So they literally were driving back and forth across the country to talk about, rallies they were holding or successes they had, things like that. So the homophile movement in the 1950s. Again, come 1969, we see the word gay becoming the umbrella term for all LGBTQ folks, eventually coming down to the initialism of GL, GLB, GLBT. So again, lots of changes over the year, and then landing where we are today with LGBTQ plus, and then the term queer that I mentioned before. I'm going to put this last slide up here. If you want to grab if you've got your phone, if you want a copy of the glossary to download, go ahead and nab that with your phone. Otherwise, we'll also mail it out to you with the slideshows later on. But if you want to grab one right now, again, it's 4 pages long, so there's a lot of information on that. But what I recommend people do is once you get that glossary, just read through it, look for labels and identities that you don't know, or maybe that you've heard from nieces, nephews, children, whatever it might be, and just read the definition. You don't need to memorize all of them. You now have it as a resource, shall we say, going into the future. So lots and lots of great resources there. I mentioned before that part of what I'm focused on here today is on senior stuff. What I want to do is to share a quick tale from an individual who lived in Albany, New York. Edward Thomas Ryan, as it says on the bottom of the screen here, he died in June of 2024. Before his death, a niece and nephew worked with him to create what was going to be read at his memorial. And I just want to read part of what's on here. So it says here, Edward wanted to share the following. I must tell you one more thing. I was gay all my life, through grade school, through high school, through college, through life. I was in a loving and caring relationship with Paul Cavagnaro in North Greenbush. He was the love of my life. We had 25 great years together. Paul died in 1994 from a medical procedure gone wrong. I will be buried next to Paul. And this is the tough part. I am sorry for not having the courage to come out as gay. I was afraid of being ostracized by family, friends, and coworkers. Seeing how people like me were treated, I just could not do it. Now that my secret is known, I'll forever rest in peace. So again, as we're looking at older folks to understand where they may be and what they may or may not be willing to share is incredibly important to keep in mind. Thank you, Jennifer. I see the heart going up the screen. Yeah, it's a powerful, powerful piece. And happily today, I didn't break down too much. Oftentimes when I read through this, I end up emotionally just losing myself. But again, he was in Albany, died just over a year ago. You can still find some information online more about him if you should want, but a really powerful statement. And the whole idea of I was afraid of being ostracized by family, friends, and coworkers is a really important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at LGBTQ folks. Keeping in mind that most Americans believe that elders should be taken care of by family members, okay? And oftentimes LGBTQ folks don't have that. Okay, our siblings may have disowned us, our parents may want nothing to do with us, or whatever, all sorts of different ways. So the traditional supports are these ones listed here, but what we know is that for many LGBTQ folks, those things are not something that are going to play off. 39% of LGBTQ plus folks have been rejected by at least a family member, sometimes all family members, or friends. Likewise, 30% of LGBTQ plus people have been physically threatened or attacked. And if we begin looking at trans and gender expansive individual, that number rises up to 61%. And then we wonder why they may be unwilling to be as out and visible as we think people should be. It's because of this history that they have had to face. So again, as you're doing your rural organizing work, just understand that there are ways to help build bridges to help people get beyond some of that hurt that they may be feeling. From AARP, they've got great resources up, by the way, on their website, but LGBTQ adults are concerned about the care and support that they can rely on as they age. Okay, whether that be from a nursing home or a care community or elders community or friends and other people in their pickleball court, right? So people are concerned that they will get the support that they need. 63% of LGBTQ adults have played that role of providing support to a friend, a partner, a parent, or someone else. So kind of like myself back in the 1980s, helping 6 individuals, friends of mine, who were dying of AIDS. Okay, not many 20-year-olds spend that kind of time helping somebody else pass away, but it is a reality that I did indeed get to experience, as it were. So as we're getting towards the final minutes here, a couple last things I want to put up there, and then I'll try to shut up and see if anybody has questions they want to put out there. Again, I mentioned going to see clients or working with individuals, being out doing community events. Again, I learned a lot of lessons doing community work throughout the Midwest, as it were, back in the day. And I just want to share some of this ideas about creating a caring space from a healthcare perspective, as well as a community organizing perspective. So they kind of overlap. I already mentioned, to me, the number one is visuals. Figure out a way to have that flag on your shirt or on the back of your car or, hanging somewhere or on your email, whatever it might be, and it might be as simple as a little rainbow piece of ribbon that's hanging on your backpack or something, all sorts of different ways. But those visuals can be so important. And I know personally, because I was a patient here at the University of Rochester before I was an employee here. And I remember being pushed down the hallway on the gurney and passing office doors that had rainbow stickers or safe space stickers on the doors and thinking, oh my God, okay, I'm okay here. Okay, these people will help me. I don't have to stay closeted, right? So there's all sorts of things to just sort of keep in mind as far as how you can give a visual message. That ties right in with language. Just be thoughtful and careful. Don't assume that somebody is heterosexual, right? Again, my hospital visit that I just mentioned, I came out of the surgery unit and, I'm all kind of doped up as I'm coming back into reality, as it were. And a care provider, and to this day, I don't know if it was a nurse, a tech, whatever, said something about, do you have family here? And I just kind of remember going, yeah, I think they're here. And this person looked at me and said, well, if your wife stops here, tell them to come to the desk to check in, right? So there was this assumption, and they were using the word wife for me. And again, I wasn't legally married to anybody at that point in time, but we need to just be thoughtful of language and how powerful that can be, and that we don't want to assume people's identities. Again, that those kids may have 2 moms at home or 2 dads at home, right? So just be careful. This also goes to programming and generational differences. So here in Rochester, there's a senior community legacy at Clover that every year they have a big, huge pride celebration. Okay, they have a pride barbecue at in the senior community. They have drag queens come in. I mean, they get huge numbers of people coming down and participating in these events. Even though one would think, well, the senior community, you don't need, well, you're not going to do that. But what they find is a lot of allies. And when I actually spoke there this year at their event, and I had a lot of people say, well, I've got grandkids who've come out as one of these identities. I don't understand. What should I do? How can I, make them feel welcome? Things like that. So just consider doing programming, consider generational differences, all those different pieces. All right. Getting towards the end here. Last thing I want to do is put up here a couple of names that you may or may not know. Here in Rochester, we have Rainbow Seniors Rock. It's a group, again, for people age 50 plus. However, we welcome people of all ages to come in. We do lunches on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We do chair yoga twice a week. We do game nights, things like that. We just recently relocated, if you're from Rochester, kind of behind Village Gate. Sage Upstate is over in Syracuse. Likewise, seniors, LGBTQ seniors group available. And then RSVP, or the Rainbow Seniors Visible and Proud, is in Buffalo. So these three organizations all kind of talk to each other regularly, but they're all part of upstate New York work from, again, Syracuse, Buffalo, and here in Rochester, focused on LGBTQ seniors. Last thing I want to put out there, I promise, is this little piece, just to be aware of it. If you go into the New York State Office of Aging website, they have an LGBTQ resource guide. It's got some great information in it. It's worth taking a look at, figuring out if there's materials there that'll be valuable to you or things that you want to or need to learn. You can just go in and download it. And with that, I am officially done yammering. I could go on and on and on for hours and bring up lots of other stuff, but I'm going to pause here. We technically have about 2 minutes left from what I'm seeing, and be more than happy to answer any questions people have or anything else that people want to put forward. I'm going to turn off my presentation. Whoops. There we go. And come back into just fully. So anybody, any thoughts or comments? I mean, I see stuff going into the chat. Anything there I need to be aware of?
So I think people really appreciated the historical part. I think some of us sort of assumed that LGBTQ sort of appeared sometime in the 80s or something, and so it was helpful to hear the background.
That's terrific. Like I said, I'm a bit of a nerd. There's some really great stuff out there too these days, on almost all TV channels, documentaries. There's one on public TV. So if you're a donor, you have free access to their documentaries on looking at LGBTQ history stuff. I think it's called Pride in America. I don't remember. It's part of their what is the program? Something America. Anyway, it'll come to me. My brain is old. Okay, I'll just leave it that
Well,
way.
you covered a lot. Does anybody have any questions or things that they would like to share? It looks like Paul might have something. And oh, the origin of the word pride. That's a great question. I have no idea where that came from.
It really comes out of that revolt, as it were, in 1969 in New York City. It was this whole idea of come out, be proud, to identify yourself. And that's really what started the movement. So the very first Pride parade was in Manhattan the year after that event happened in June of 1969. 1970 was the very first Pride parade, and it really caught on nationally. There was also one in San Francisco that year, but that really led it. If you didn't know, here at the University of Rochester, we had one of the very first student groups in the nation, the Gay Liberation Front, it was called. And on our former student union here on campus, there's actually a plaque that was put up a couple of years ago honoring the 50th anniversary of the first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front, as one of the very first. Actually, I've been told it was the second gay organization in the country or in the state.
All right, well, that's great. Thank you, Shannon, for that. Other people have questions?
Yeah, this is Jennifer. I have a question. The doctor that you were talking about in Germany who started the institute, how was that funded? Was it self-funded, or did he raise money? I'm just kind of, especially you're right to that point, like the turmoil at that time. I'm just kind of curious where that came from.
It was individually funded initially. It also was connected with a higher ed institution. And then I don't know all the details of how they did the funding, but they did amazing work. He sent researchers around the world to interview and look at Aboriginal cultures, so down to the Amazon and into the mountains and whatever else.
Wow.
and they brought all this research back, and unfortunately it all got burnt. Okay, but amazing stuff. Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institute of Sexuality.
Thank you.
I just dropped my email into the chat if you want to reach out to my personal email. It might be the best way. But again, I'm glad to have any other conversations with people. I know we're at 2:03, so I want to be respectful and just say thank you very much for your time. But I have luckily nowhere else to go. So if you want to ask questions, I'm open to that. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Janai is going to put the slide up for our evaluation. So thank you. And we really do want to let everybody know this is recorded, and Scott was kind enough to put his own email in there. So if you have other things that you would like to ask him about specific to your organization, please feel free. We wanted to let you know that we do have some extra webinars coming up. So we have a webinar with the Comptroller's Office on the October 30th. We have a policy update from Washington, D.C. on November 20th. And we have an event around mental health, supporting mental health in New York State on December 11th. So we wanted to make sure that you were aware of these additional opportunities coming up. These are all free and open to the public. And we do want you to do the evaluation. If you want CHES credits, you must do the evaluation, but even if you're not, we actually use this information to plan our sessions for next year. So we very much appreciate you taking just a few minutes to do the webinar evaluation form. Again, thank you very much to Scott Fearing. Obviously a wealth of information. I would definitely think of calling on you again for expertise in this area. And thanks for everybody who was able to come today. We do appreciate your interest in this topic and for rural New York. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank
Have
you
a
all.
wonderful day.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Scott. Much appreciated. Have a great day,
We'll be in
everyone.
touch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.